Okay, so get this, right? We're going deep on this declassified CIA paper, this one from December 1987. It's called uh, The Chernobyl Accident, Social and Political Implications. And, you probably remember the images, right? The firefighters
Yeah.
battling the blaze in Pripyat like a ghost town, that lingering fear of radiation. But this report, it takes us behind the Iron Curtain. See how Chernobyl really shook up Soviet society under Gorbachev?
It's a case study for sure in
Right.
crisis management. Like, how do you balance openness? You have to be open, but you also need to maintain control,
Mm.
especially when you have a disaster this massive, right? The report, it really digs into that, like the Soviet Union, how secretive they were at first, the delayed response, and how they tried to, well, to shape the whole narrative.
Yeah, so the report starts by laying it all out, right?
Yeah.
Like what led up to that explosion at Chernobyl, reactor number 4, April 1986. It's crazy, right? How the Soviet Union, I mean, they were known for their, tight grip on information. They really tried to downplay how serious the accident was at first.
Yeah, that's very consistent with their usual approach, especially with sensitive information like containment,
Right.
right? Preventing panic. Those were probably the goals. But we'll see. It really backfired, and spectacularly, I might add. And what's important here is the report. It points to those design flaws in the reactor itself and the operational errors, not just human error. That's what they said at first, right?
It gets even crazier. The report actually mentions a Ukrainian publication that, and this is nuts, ran an article, and get this, it exposed safety concerns at the Chernobyl plant. And this was just a week before the accident. Crazy, right? Like foreshadowing.
Imagine that. I mean, safety concerns are in the press like days before disaster strikes. I mean, it really makes you think, like it suggests there's a culture where people who disagreed or raised concerns about safety, were silenced.
Yeah, this is where it gets really gripping. The report goes into detail about that delayed evacuation of Pripyat. That was the city closest to the reactor. Okay, so picture this. The reactor explodes, but for 36 hours, things are normal, life goes on.
It took a full 36 hours before they started evacuating those 45,000 residents. The report even describes people, going about their day totally oblivious. I mean, no idea that this invisible danger was swirling around them.
It's kind of mind-blowing, right? The report suggests that this delay that they waited so long to evacuate might have been because, well, political considerations. Like they were trying to avoid panic, right?
Right.
Project this image that everything was under control.
Yeah, that delay says a lot about the Soviet system and its priorities. The report also raises some questions about that initial evacuation zone, that 30-kilometer zone. Some scientists, they argued that it was too small, like it didn't really reflect how far the radiation had spread.
So it wasn't just a delayed evacuation, but also maybe a miscalculated one. I mean, it makes you think, how much of this was just political maneuvering behind the scenes.
The report, it hints at that, that the Soviet leadership, they were struggling, trying to reconcile the scientific data with political expediency. I mean,
Right.
they were under so much pressure to maintain order, to make it seem like they were competent.
And then they went into full propaganda mode, right?
Yeah.
Trying to make it seem like the disaster was manageable, and their response, like a heroic. And get this, they released a documentary called Warning to try and spin the whole narrative in their favor.
That's so fascinating because the report, it actually analyzes how this whole propaganda thing totally backfired. Like it just made people trust them even less. Imagine encouraging people to like have a May Day celebration in Kiev weeks after the accident.
Wait, what? Like it's celebration in a city that could be, affected by radiation.
Yeah. It was a desperate attempt, to make things look normal while they were dealing with this, well, massive crisis. And the report, it suggests that this move and the other propaganda too, people just saw it as fake, disingenuous, and it just pushed the Soviet people even further away.
So not only did they like totally mishandle the initial response, they then try to cover it up with propaganda that just makes everything worse.
Yeah.
You can just feel that, rising tension and distrust.
The report, it really highlights how this wasn't just about, a nuclear disaster. This exposed those deeper issues, like within the Soviet system itself, like a lack of transparency, struggling to balance the science with their image, and really just a disregard for what the public was concerned about.
This wasn't just, some abstract political game, right?
Yeah.
This report, it doesn't shy away from the human cost at all.
Right. And you have to remember, this is 1987. People were terrified. Cancer, birth defects, long-term health problems. The report, it details that anxiety, over-contaminated food and water, the psychological trauma.
And it must have been impossible for people to trust anything official, especially with the government and their history,
Yeah.
the secrecy, the propaganda.
The report, It paints this picture of a society just grappling with fear and uncertainty, and all fueled by rumors and a distrust of the authorities. And it highlights the strain on their medical system, the Soviet medical system. They were already burdened, and now they had to deal with all the fallout from Chernobyl. And here's the thing, right? The truly fascinating part. The Chernobyl disaster didn't just expose those flaws, it kind of became a catalyst for change.
Oh, okay. I'm listening. How did this disaster, I mean, as tragic as it was, how did it spark change in the Soviet system?
Well, you got to remember, this was during Gorbachev, right, and his
Oh.
reforms. Chernobyl, with all the, mishandling and cover-ups, it gave those pushing for change more fuel for their fire. You know what I mean?
So Chernobyl it became like this unexpected weapon for reformers.
In a way, yeah. It showed just how inefficient that centralized Soviet system was and the lack of local control, right? The report even mentions some prominent journalists using Chernobyl as like ammunition to criticize the government.
So you're telling me that even in, an authoritarian regime, a disaster like this could make people speak out.
Exactly. Journalists like Yarosh Kravchuk, we mentioned him earlier, he started questioning not just the accident, but like the foundation of Soviet governance itself.
So did Chernobyl contribute to pushing the Soviet Union toward, well, a more democratic, decentralized system?
You could definitely interpret it that way. I mean, the report doesn't explicitly say that, but it does provide some evidence to support that view. The disaster and the aftermath, it forced them to reckon with the limitations of their system, which just fueled those calls for reform.
That's a pretty powerful impact. What about the environmental movement in the Soviet Union? This report mentioned Chernobyl sparked some change there too, right?
You got it. And it wasn't just about nuclear power. Chernobyl became this rallying cry for a much broader environmental movement. The report mentions those protests against new nuclear plants, but also this growing concern about pollution in general, environmental degradation.
It's almost like the disaster, woke people up to the environmental risks they were facing.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And remember, this was still under an authoritarian regime. Speaking out was risky, yet people were galvanized by Chernobyl to speak out against those threats to their health, their environment.
Talk about courage. The report even mentioned how the local Soviet press started openly discussing these environmental issues, often in direct relation to Chernobyl, too.
That's right. Publications, especially in regions with, nuclear power plants, they started publishing articles about safety concerns, criticizing government policies, even accounts of local protests.
Wow, that shift in media coverage is huge.
It was a sign, even if it was small, that iron grip on information was loosening.
So Chernobyl acted as this catalyst for change on like multiple fronts, politically, environmentally, even freedom of information. It's kind of mind-blowing how much impact one event can have.
It really is. Chernobyl forced the Soviet Union to, reassess its priorities. It exposed how vulnerable the system was, and ultimately it empowered citizens to demand change.
This makes me think about how relevant Chernobyl still is today. The report is from '87, right? But it feels like incredibly timely, even now. What do you see as the most important takeaways, the things that still resonate with us today?
I think the biggest takeaway is transparency and accountability, especially when we're talking about technology, right? Especially something as powerful as nuclear energy. Chernobyl was this tragic example of what happens when information is suppressed and risks are downplayed.
You're right. We've seen that same pattern play out in other disasters, haven't we? When there's a lack of transparency, it always just makes things worse.
Absolutely. And another key takeaway is the power of citizen engagement.
Huh.
Even in a rigid system like the Soviet Union, public pressure could actually force change.
So it's not just about waiting for those in power to, do the right thing. It's about citizens being informed, being engaged, and demanding accountability.
Exactly. Chernobyl showed that people, when they're informed and united, they can make a difference. They can demand accountability and safer practices.
It also makes you think about those long-term consequences, right, of these technological disasters. We often focus on the immediate impact, the casualties, the destruction, but Chernobyl reminds us that those effects, they can, ripple outward for generations.
Yeah, the health concerns, the environmental damage, the trauma, these are legacies that can last long after the initial event. It's a reminder that progress has to be pursued responsibly.
We can't just chase shiny new technologies without considering the risks.
We need to be aware of those potential risks, right? Especially the long-term ones. This report, it highlights that technology itself, it's not good or bad. It's how we develop it, deploy it, that determines its impact.
That's an important distinction. Chernobyl wasn't just a failure of technology, right? It was a failure of systems, of human judgment, prioritizing short-term gains over long-term consequences.
And those lessons, they apply to way more than just nuclear power.
I'm also struck by how the report goes into, like, how Moscow reacted in those initial days.
Right. It highlights that delayed
Yeah.
response and how desperately they tried to control the narrative. The report even mentions how Moscow's initial reaction, it was shaped by that traditional secrecy that was just ingrained in the Soviet system.
That makes sense. But wasn't there also this, like, contrast between the Soviet response and, how the West reacted?
Oh, yeah. The report mentions how Soviet citizens, unlike people in the West, hadn't really mounted a successful campaign against developing nuclear power before Chernobyl.
So there was a difference in, like, public awareness and action when it came to nuclear safety between the Soviet Union and the West.
Exactly. And that difference might have contributed to, well, to the Soviet regime's commitment to nuclear energy, even with all the anxieties caused by Chernobyl.
It's like they were stuck in their ways, resistant to change, even when faced with disaster.
The report highlights how the Soviet regime then tried to, shape how the public perceived the accident, using propaganda, downplaying the severity of it all.
It's almost like they were more worried about their image than the well-being of their people.
They were trying to project this image of competence and control, but the report points out that it backfired. It just eroded public trust even further.
It's the classic example, right, of how trying to hide the truth usually makes things worse.
Yeah, and that discrepancy between how the regime portrayed the situation and the reality on the ground, it's a theme that keeps popping up throughout this whole report.
It really highlights that tension, right, between a closed authoritarian system and the need for transparency and accountability, especially during a crisis. It also makes you wonder if Gorbachev really used the disaster to, like, push his own agenda of political reforms.
But the report actually mentions that, yeah. That he exploited the disaster to remove some Central Committee holdovers from the Brezhnev era.
So while Chernobyl was this horrific tragedy, it also gave Gorbachev a chance to, like, consolidate his power and push his reforms through.
That's one way to interpret it, for sure. The disaster showed that even during a crisis, that political maneuvering and power struggles, they're still happening.
Speaking of maneuvering, this report also details the economic impact of Chernobyl, right? Focusing on the cost of decontamination and relocation.
Right. It mentions that Moscow announced this budget, 800 million rubles for compensation and decontamination. But, everyone knew the real cost would be way higher.
A disaster like this, it must have been a huge financial burden for them,
Yeah.
especially with the Soviet economy already struggling.
It definitely put those trade-offs between economic development and, the risks of nuclear energy into perspective.
And it's not just about the immediate costs either. Those long-term costs, things like healthcare for those exposed to radiation, environmental cleanup, those must have been substantial too.
Oh, absolutely. And the report doesn't just stick to, the facts and figures. It also looks at the psychological and sociological impact of the disaster.
Right, it talks about the trauma, what people experienced after they were forced from their homes, the constant fear of contamination, and how the disaster just eroded the public's trust in their government.
It even mentions how the incident just amplified existing tensions between Moscow and the republics, especially Ukraine and Belarus.
So Chernobyl had this ripple effect throughout Soviet society, influencing the politics, increasing anxiety, even shaping national identities.
That's exactly right. It's a reminder that a technological disaster, it's not an isolated event. It can have far-reaching consequences, shaping the present and future of a whole nation.
It's incredible how one event, like Chernobyl, could expose so many vulnerabilities within a whole society, right?
Yeah, and it's
And
that exposure that makes Chernobyl, I don't know, such a fascinating case study.
one thing that really stuck with me from the report was how the Soviet Union, they tried to control the whole narrative around Chernobyl.
Oh, yeah, that's classic. Information control happens in authoritarian systems all the time. They want to manage how people see things, minimize the damage, project an image of strength.
But like the report shows, it didn't work, did it?
Their initial, secrecy and the delayed response, it just fueled distrust and rumors. And when they tried to downplay the whole accident, well, outside sources contradicted them.
The report even mentions how Soviet officials were, like, obsessed with how Western media was covering Chernobyl.
They were terrified, of looking weak, especially during the Cold War. Any weakness and, well, their rivals could exploit it.
So the disaster basically became a propaganda battle.
Exactly. They're fighting to contain the, physical fallout, and at the same time, they had to manage the information fallout.
The report highlights how this struggle to control the narrative,
Hmm.
it kind of played into Gorbachev's glasnost policy, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Chernobyl became a test for Glasnost. It forced them to confront the limits of secrecy and that growing demand for transparency.
It's like it exposed the contradictions within glasnost itself.
Gorbachev, he wanted to seem open, reform-minded, right. But that instinct, that need to control information, it was still so deep in the Soviet system.
So Chernobyl kind of became this pressure point, pushing the Soviet Union, even if they didn't want to, toward a more open society.
It was a reluctant process and uneven, but the disaster, it definitely made that push for transparency go faster.
This brings us to, I think, another really key theme in the report, those long-term consequences of Chernobyl. Even back in '87, they were wrestling with all that uncertainty.
It was a disaster, but like in slow motion.
Yeah.
The long-term health effects, the environment, it was a huge unknown.
The report talks about the fear, right? That fear of cancer, birth defects, all these long-term problems.
And that fear was, well, it was understandable. The science was still, it was evolving, which created so much anxiety, so much distrust.
The report also mentions the psychological trauma, what the evacuees experience.
Imagine being forced to leave your home and not knowing if you'd ever go back. The disruption, the loss, all of it contributed to a really deep trauma.
And that trauma, it wasn't limited to just those immediate victims, was it?
No, Chernobyl created this feeling, this anxiety and uncertainty that spread throughout Soviet society. It challenged how safe they felt, how much they trusted their government.
It's fascinating how the report explores both, right? Those technical aspects of the disaster, but also the psychological and social impacts.
It gives you a much more complete picture of the human cost, the real cost of Chernobyl.
It also ties into that idea that the disaster was like a turning point for the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it exposed those cracks in the system, right? Accelerated those trends that were already there and forced them to ask some really difficult questions.
The report even suggests that Chernobyl might have contributed to, well, to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union.
It's impossible to say for sure, but it definitely weakened the regime, and it fueled dissent. It became a symbol of the system's failures.
This report, it offers insights that I think they're still relevant today.
Chernobyl's a case study. In crisis management, the risks of technology, the importance of being transparent, and what happens after a disaster. Those themes, they still resonate with us today.
As we face new challenges, climate change, AI, all of it, those lessons from Chernobyl, they feel more important than ever.
Chernobyl, it reminds us, that progress, especially with technology, has to be pursued responsibly. We have to be aware of the risks and committed to open communication.
It's a reminder that, well, that we have to learn from those mistakes, the mistakes of the past.
And that we need to work together to create a future where technology, it actually serves humanity.
Well, you've taken us on quite a journey with this declassified CIA report. We've seen how Chernobyl, it still casts a long shadow, doesn't it?
What I find fascinating is how this event, how it forced the Soviet Union to re-examine themselves, their society, and their relationship with technology.
And that leaves us, I think, with a question for everyone listening to think about. What does Chernobyl, what does it mean for us today? How can we learn from those mistakes of the past, and advocate for a safer future, a more transparent future?